So all these really nice, clean sculptural elements here, as well as this pretty interesting AO mask here, believe it or not, are all enabled by math that goes above 1 and below 0. Let's figure it out. Let's get to the graph. So before we get to those kind of cool sculpted elements and all the interesting masking we can do with HDR ranges, we should probably just talk about what they are first. This might be something that's just not familiar to a lot of people. Most students I teach aren't aware of this at all. The first thing to know is that under any node, I'm looking at a uniform color here. This little piece of notation after the texture size is telling you the data type and the bit depth for this particular node. In this case, it's telling you this is a linear grayscale texture and it's 8 bits. You can change that. Most nodes, uniform color is actually kind of a rare exception. The majority of nodes in Substance Designer will default, grayscale nodes at least, to a linear 16-bit depth, which is a lot more information than the 8 bits. And to give you an idea of what that looks like, if you had a Perlin noise, again, comes in at linear 16, and we used some node to step it down. I'm using the transform, I could have used the levels, I could have used anything really. But I'm going to go up and switch this node's output format to 8 bits. So now it's gone from 16 to 8. And what does that mean? Well, if we look at this on a histogram, we can see that we have 0 and 255 as our white and our black. Those numbers are probably familiar to anyone coming from Photoshop, right? This just means this is an 8-bit depth image. So we have 256, including 0, possible shades of gray tones here. Starting from 0 being black, 255 being white at the end, and then you have the 254 in between there, possible steps of gray, which actually isn't a lot. It's really, really low. If you were to plug something like this into a normal map, you would see a lot of artifacting. If you get close to this, you can actually see the stair stepping because there's not enough information to resolve how smooth that gradient ought to be. That's why for the most part, most of these noises are linear 16, so you get these nice smooth interpolations. And the way to think about it is really, you would think like, well, linear 8, linear 16's got to be twice as good. It's not, right? Because we're talking about bits per channel here. So every time you go up a bit per channel, you're doubling the amount of grayscale available to you. So linear 16 is a lot more than linear 8, right? It's an exponential increase per bit you gain as it's doubling. So if you actually look at the histogram scan of a 16-bit grayscale image, we have 65,000 possible gray shades. Right? So there's a lot more precision. We can achieve much smoother gradients. Most of the time, you're going to be wanting to using 16-bit grayscale as your default, and it's a good thing that designer chooses to make it such. The one exception is uniform color. When you're working with base color, it's not uncommon to have 8-bit color textures driving your albedo. But even then, there are exceptions, like most things with designer. So how do we manipulate this further? One thing we can do is switch these up to any of these HDR formats, 16-bit floating point or 32-bit floating point. And what that basically means is that these are linear values. These are linear grayscale values as well in this case, except in between 0 and 1, we have 0.16 zeros followed by a 1, 0.16 or 15 zeros followed by a 1, 15 zeros followed by a 2, 15 zeros followed by a 3, so on and so forth. So you have way more shades of gray. You have over 1 million if we're looking at it at 32 or even 16. Right? This is way smoother. We have a ton of possible information. Some nodes you'll find actually going up to one of the HDR ranges. That's what the F is standing is here to indicate. It's floating point. You'll find often that, especially working with height maps, that having some floating point math will make things more smooth if you're getting a bunch of artifacting, but that's a topic for another video probably. For us, what's interesting for this video is that using either of the high definition ranges, whether it's 16 or 32, will allow us to access high definition range. That is like numbers that are below 0 and numbers that are above 1. We'll be able to do math between them. You don't need this. It's just like when we're talking about the samples on nodes. It's not one of those things where higher number equals better. In this case, the higher number enables a feature that we really need to do this specific thing. If you don't need to do that specific thing, if you have no requirements for it, then there's no point in doing it because you're just paying for more expensive noise when you don't need it. In our case, we do need it. And here's a good use case for when you might want to do math above 1 and below 0, trying to achieve that sort of stylized sculpting example I showed at the beginning. So I'm just going to open my 3D view. We'll view it on a plane. And I've just set up in, there you go. The UI is a little wacky there. I've just set up here in this graph a pretty standard base color getting multiplied over by an ambient occlusion. Got some curvature going on as well, just so we have a bit of a better time seeing. Normal map, height map. And let's just take a square shape, move it in a bit, bevel him, and plug that guy in. And I actually want to turn the displacement on, so I'm going to go to my material, go to tessellation. Then I'm going to turn that scale up. Cool. Might even go higher. There you go. That's probably too high. And I think I want my normal map a bit stronger. Cool. There's our shape. And I want my curvature. We always like to see curvature. It makes it easier for you guys to see. Cool. So what I want to do in essence here is just have edge damage occur in the transitions between 0 and black. Right? I don't want any to happen up here. I want the shape to remain solid. I only want it being done on the edges, right? It's almost like using, if you're familiar with ZBrush, using a trim dynamic right along the edges of a plane to break it up. That's actually pretty hard. It's not clear what you should be doing with the blend mode to achieve that. We need to go above 0 and below 1, because the problem is if we have something like cells and we want to, say, subtract that from this height map, right? Subtract goes on top. What we will be subtracting from below goes on top. This doesn't work very well, right? Everything kind of just gets brought down because this texture goes from 0 to 1, right? We have black and white and everything in between. This texture is quite bright, right? Like, so the values are, I don't think there's anything in here that's above like 0.4 or 0.5. It's very, very bright. So if we're subtracting, you know, something between 0.4 and 1 from this texture, we're just going to crush a ton of it, right? It's all going to sink below 0, which means it's just going to resolve itself as black, right? This isn't what we want. We're getting the worst of both worlds, right? We're damaging the top and the sides, but we're just caving the sides beneath the plane, essentially, because all those numbers are going below 0. So this sucks. You might think, well, why not try inverting the noise and then doing something like a min? And this also isn't great, right? Because the min is just a filter basically saying I'll let the darker of the two pixels through, comparing input A and B. And in this case, this image is just so much darker than this one that for the most part, we're almost getting exclusively image B. There's some exceptions, like here you can see the beveled cube, because here that just happens to be darker than here on the noise, right? So this also isn't really great. What we really want to do is, instead of having this value range go from 0 to 1, we'd rather go from 0 to 2. Because then when we subtract a texture from it that can at most go to brightness 1, that means that after the math is done, our value that was originally 1, that is now 2, at the very most that's going to happen is it's going to get subtracted down to 1, which will keep it white. We essentially want this white square here to stay white, right? Really easy to do. We just need to take this shape, we can get rid of the levels there, and we're going to grab a uniform color, switch it to grayscale. You know, dragging that number, the 1, most of the time in Designer, when you see a slider like this, you can go higher. So I'm at 2 now. And if I multiply this, nothing happens, right? And that's just because this is a linear 8 image. This is linear 16. It doesn't know that we can go above that right now, or that we're asking to go above it. But if I switch this uniform color to, let's just put it to 32, now you see this change a lot, right? And it actually makes a ton of sense because the way it changed makes a ton of sense. Because if we were to just blow this up for a second and go to our sketch and snitch here, originally we have a value of 1 here and a value of 0 along this line, and somewhere in the exact middle you would have 0.5. So if we were to multiply all these numbers by 2, which we're just doing, the 0 should remain 0, right? Because multiplying anything by 0 is 0. The 0.5 will become 1, right? Basically where our white now begins, and our 1 will become 2. And it makes a lot of sense if we switch to this node. That halfway mark is now where white begins. 0 stays 0. And then everywhere from where our new 1 is, like where our white is, all the way up to where the new 2 is, we can't see, right? There's no way for us to kind of visually see those numbers that are above 1, at least as described by a luminance value on a black and white texture, right? What does it mean to show a color above 1 or a luminance above white? You don't see anything. In a rendering engine, right, if you were to do something like this in Unreal, these pixels that are above 1, assuming they cross the bloom threshold, would begin to bloom, right? So the pixels would leak into neighboring pixels and you'd get that kind of glow that you'd expect from an emissive material like a candle flame or a torchlight, light bulb, whatever. And so now that we have this 0 to 2 range, and we're subtracting our original noise, we're still getting a look we don't really like. This is kind of like the original thing we didn't like the look of. However, that's just because this guy also has to be a floating point value. So if we switch him, just make him 32, now we're getting the look we want. And I'll just make sure we run this back out to all of our outputs. And this is really cool. I think my displacement turned off, so I'm just going to make sure that's back on. Now we have exactly what we want. Just height. A little tall. We'll turn that down a little. Just a bit. Perfect. So now we get this really cool kind of trim dynamic look, right? It's very sculptural. And it's really the only way you can do this is taking advantage of the HDR math. It's the only way that makes it, well, there's other ways of doing it, but they're way more complicated and actually pricier to do in the graph in terms of timing. This is the easiest way to do this. It's really sweet, and you can change this noise to get very different results, right? It's super, super cool. We could switch this guy to a disk or something, right? And we're kind of making these, we're already making these like really interesting, super clean sculptural shapes pretty quickly, right? You can imagine a lot you can do with this. So this is the first example I wanted to show of like where putting math above and beyond those numbers would help. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to give us 4 of those shapes like we had at the beginning of the video. I'll just divide this by 2. I'm just tiling the shape more, just so that we have a little like this, and I'll have to turn the bevel down to compensate. We could turn it up a bit. Cool. Sweet. And I'm also going to make these a bit more higher frequency, the pieces of damage. There you go. Cool. So we have these. The second way we can, or the second use for this, not the only two, there's many, but another good one is making this AO more interesting. So we could imagine this stuff as kind of a stone. So let's give it some, let's make it like a light blue, like a slate or something. And this AO as it stands is quite boring. And so we'll leave this here. I'm going to take this and make it quite strong, but lower the radius a bit so it's really tight. Something like this. So we can see a really clear gradient. Probably want to go lower. Sweet. Like that. So we have a really obvious gradient of in our AO here. Going from black to white, right? Black to white. So what a lot of people will do and this is, you ought to do this in my opinion, we're not just going to multiply this down to the base color. We're actually going to use an inverted version of our AO as a mask. Like this. And blend a different color over top. Right, it's a bit more interesting. So instead of it just being black, we can make it kind of like a brown, lower saturation, much darker. A bit more interesting than just black. Anytime you can get a new color in, it's helpful. So you might actually saturate that more so it's a bit more obvious. You make it a bit more red. And now I'm just, you caught me just messing around now. So this looks cool. And a lot of what people do here, or often what people do, is make this mask more interesting by doing something like taking a noise and multiplying it over it, right, at its most basic. I don't really like this. It's not the look for everyone. But the reason I primarily don't like this is because, sure, it makes the breakup in the mask here more interesting for sure. Moisture noise, one of my favorites, like probably my favorite procedural noise in Substance Designer. Despite how much I love it, it's not making me love this, right? Really cool, interesting here, but I don't like that we're losing the contact AO in a lot of places. And that just makes sense because we have this number, that goes between 1 and 0, or pretty close to 1 and then to 0. There are some areas in here where we're going to be multiplying it by 0, right? And just turning it off completely, right? Because all of this stuff, when it gets multiplied to 0, it's just disappearing. And we don't like the look of that. Or I don't. This might work for some things, but I just want the best of both worlds here. I want to keep my AO really tight to the corners, have that grunge mask. And I also want more interesting breakup in the transition. So to accomplish this, we're going to really just do the same thing. The first step I'm going to do is just auto level this AO, just so that I assure that I have full white and full black, whereas before I think I was slightly off. We're going to do the exact same thing that we did with our height map. I'm going to take our map and I'm going to multiply it by 2. Again, don't listen to the slider. You can go above 1. I'm going to set this to 32-bit floating point. Multiply it. And again, this makes a lot of sense, right? Same thing. This was our 1. This is our 0. 0.5 is somewhere in the middle. We multiplied it by 2. So this is now 2. Our 1 is now where the middle was. And we still have 0. And now, same thing. I'm going to subtract this moisture noise instead. Right? Much more interesting. I actually want this guy to be floating point as well. And this is a hell of a lot better. This guy also should be. Sweet. So this is much better. We have our full contact grunge, and then in the breakup, or in the transition rather, we have all the interesting breakup from that sweet, sweet moisture noise. Right? So this looks much more interesting. We get the best of both worlds, right? It's perfect. We don't have to choose. Now, one thing to point out, this is like a final good reminder here, just good housekeeping. An opacity input on a blend mode, you can think of as a linear interpolation, right? It's just an alpha. We're just saying, hey, where there's black here, I want input B. And when there's white, I want input A. Right now, this isn't just black and white, right? Numbers are potentially going below 0 and are certainly going above 1. And if you plug numbers that go go below 0 or above 1 into a lerp like this, into an opacity mask, the colors start to do wacky stuff. This color is now much darker than what we had picked, right? The colors start to loop around. Because what does it mean to say if 0 is blue and 1 is brown, what does a value of 1.5 mean, right? So moral of the story, you can't put in a value into a mask that goes above 1 or below 0. You need to use something like a clamp first. So by default, this clamp is just going to say, hey, if you're lower than 0, you're going to become 0. And if you're higher than 1, you're going to become 1. That's not going to change all the cool look we had before the clamp. It's just ensuring that those numbers return to a normalized 0 to 1 range. So we plug this in and then plug this out. It's much closer to our original color, but we still get that really cool breakup as well as that consistent ambient occlusion shadow. So I hope this really helps. This is like a really good introduction into using HDR ranges. There's a million reasons for why you might want to do this. No doubt we'll get into more of them. If you all like the video and subscribe, please, it'd be greatly appreciated. I really want to make more of this stuff. It takes a lot of time away from me doing other things I could be doing, right? So all the support is really helpful to get me to just keep doing this. I have a laundry list of about 70 things I'd like to get to. And the more kind of positive response here, and the more, I'm not just speaking out into the void, the more I'm going to do here, and the more I'm going to try to put stuff out there. So like, subscribe, tell your friends, share it, all the standard YouTube guys stuff. And I will see you guys later.